What is up, fantasy fans? Welcome back to The Data Straight, a channel here on YouTube dedicated to translating real-world data into actionable insights that enable you to make data-driven changes to your fantasy lineups. My name is Reese, a very warm welcome to you, and in today's video we're going to take a look at the results from the Belgian Grand Prix, and I'm going to spend a few minutes walking you through how the scores from Spa have impacted the Fantasy Drivers' Championship. Before we get into the video, I just want to remind everyone that I am not in any way affiliated with the Formula One brand or the company Play On that sponsors the game. I'm just a big fan of the sport, a big fan of the game, and I'm out here making videos on YouTube because I really love talking about this stuff and I want to build a community of other like-minded people to share this with here on YouTube. So, with that being said, let's get into it. Okay, so we'll start with the race classification. On the left, we have the actual race results and the driver's scores, and on the right, we have the fantasy race result and the driver's scores. No surprises, on a weekend where Max absolutely dominated the rest of the pack, he also clocked a massive score in fantasy. Anyone with Max in their team this weekend must have been pleased, as the Dutchman racked up a very impressive 49 points. With this win, Max has now won the last 3 races, so going into his home race, the Mad Lad is on a dynamite run of form, and the smart money would not be betting against the defending world champion going into Zandvoort. I will just point out that only one single point separated each of the drivers from P2 to P4. Spa really was just insanely close at the weekend from a fantasy point of view. P2 was Sergio, who scored a mega 32 points. It was a decisive 1-2 for Red Bull in the actual race, and it was a pretty solid 1-2 for Red Bull in fantasy as well. In my opinion, this is the best result you can hope for with Sergio, because unless something happens to Max, P2 is the highest position Christian Horner is going to allow Checo to aim for. P3 was Carlos and P4 was George, and this result is actually crucial for George, so stick around for the Fantasy Driver Championship update to find out why. P5 was Fernando, which was a great result. 24 points is Fernando's second biggest points haul of the season, so a mega result for him and anyone that had him in their teams. P6 was Leclerc, who was demoted from P5 in real life due to a 5-second time penalty for speeding in the pit lane, and he was demoted in fantasy due to a 4-point penalty for losing 2 places in the race. After Leclerc, we have Esteban in P7, who actually finished P9 in fantasy because, unlike in the race where Esteban pulled off 2 mega double overtakes, first on Ricciardo and Latifi and the second on Seb and Pierre, in fantasy it was actually Seb and Pierre that overtook Esteban for P7 and P8. For anyone that hasn't seen the onboards, there's an interview Sky did with Esteban, and seeing his reaction to his own moves was so wholesome. After Seb and Pierre, we have Albon claiming the final points position in P10. But in fantasy, we have little Yuki, who scored his first double-digit points since the Spanish Grand Prix way back in May. Lance was P11 in both classifications, another solid double-digit score for Lance. Everyone is talking about how George is Mr. Consistent now with his P5 or higher finish, but Lance is the real Mr. Consistent. After 14 races, Lance has now scored between 8 and 16 points in every single race in 2022. After Lance, we have Lando in P12, up 2 places on his fantasy classification. Nothing really to say about Lando, it was a very lackluster weekend for McLaren. Yuki was P13, but in fantasy we have K-Mag, who after spending a few weeks in Mick's shadow has now managed to pull it back. So going into Zandvoort, there is now not even one single point between K-Mag and Mick in the Fantasy Driver Championship. After Yuki we have Zhou, and then we have Daniel, who managed P15 in the race, but in fantasy Daniel only managed to avoid back-to-back P20s by 4 points. Up next it's K-Mag and Mick in P16 and P17, but in fantasy we actually have Lewis, who finished 4 places above his real world classification, and that's because Lewis got into Q3 and beat George while having a 5-point qualifying streak bonus, whereas the drivers around him achieved none of these things. After Lewis's 10-point penalty for his DNF, he managed to net out with plus 4 points, which keeps him off the bottom spot, unlike real life. P18 is Latifi, and that's the same in both classifications. Latifi is currently driving for his future, but you wouldn't know it based on his performances. After scoring 0 at Spa, Latifi's fantasy point tally for the last 6 races is now a whopping 4 whole points. So on average, that 6.9 million is currently buying you 0.6 points per race. P19 was Valtteri, but in fantasy it was Daniel, which we've already covered, And then last but not least, in real life, we have Lewis, who finished P20, meaning that after his tussle with Alonso, every driver has now DNF'd at least one race in 2022. In fantasy, P20 went to Valtteri, who after spending all season fighting for his spot at the top, has now earned himself the undesirable red box for the first time this season. Valtteri's -9 in Spa means that since Silverstone, Valtteri has now netted out at exactly 0 points over the last 5 races. It's very painful because after a mega start to the season, Valtteri is now falling away and he has now actually slipped out of the top 10, being replaced by the one and only 4-time world champion Sebastian Vettel. Moving on to look at the championship visualized, and circling back to my comment at the start about George's P4 being significant, George has now overtaken Charles for P2 in the Fantasy Drivers' Championship. Going into Spa, George was trailing Charles by just 6 points, and after outscoring Charles by 10 points, George now has a 4-point lead over the Monegasque driver. This is not the first time George has overtaken Charles this season. Back in Canada, George crept ahead by 2 points, but the next race was Silverstone, where George scored his first DNF of the season, and Charles reclaimed a 19-point advantage. But now, just 4 races later, George has closed the gap and reclaimed the highly contested second spot. Max's win at the weekend has helped him continue to build an even healthier margin at the top, but if you zoom in here, you'll see Sergio has now leapfrogged over Hamilton, which we did say was very possible in the last video, although highly unlikely due to the run of form Lewis was on going into the break. If you remember, going into Spa, Lewis was on a run of 5 back-to-back podium finishes, and Sergio was kind of struggling for traction, but now, after Lewis's DNF and Sergio's P2, Sergio is now only 20 points off of catching Leclerc in P3, and 24 points off of catching Russell for P2. Carlos has also closed the gap to Hamilton, so if you look here, there are now just 58 points separating Carlos in P6 and George in P2, which means it's still very much anyone's to win, although, based on the trend indicators, the momentum is shifting and favouring George and Sergio. As you can see from the chart, there's also another battle taking place, and that's the battle for P7. This one is not as close as the battle for P2, but further down the screen we have Lando, Esteban, Fernando, Sebastian, and although he's not pictured here, you also have Valtteri, all fighting it out for P7. Seb and Valtteri are actually currently tied on 170 points each, so really Valtteri should be on here. I'll get that changed for the next video. Just 67 points separates these drivers, and in a way that will be much harder to close because the margins between these drivers are less volatile week to week. But going into Zandvoort, keep your eye on these 5 because they're all fighting to be crowned best of the rest. If we jump into the points per pound championship, we can see that this week's winner was actually Fernando, who scored 1.9 points per million it costs to acquire him. And that's his first win of the season, which is well deserved because, as we pointed out in the last video, Fernando has been on a mega run of form since the Spanish Grand Prix. P2 was Carlos and P3 was Sergio, so lots of really affordable points up for grabs this weekend. The entire podium for round 14 of the points per pound championship only costs 47.5 million, and that would have scored you a whopping 87 points. In terms of changes to the championship, the 2 biggest movers this week are Valtteri and Lando, who moved from P3 to P6 and P10 to P13. Daniel also slid another place, moving him down to P19. What's concerning for Daniel is with Yuki scoring big for the first time in 7 races, Daniel's gap to Yuki is now just 0.4 points, and their weekly averages have now converged on 0.4 points per week. If Daniel doesn't pull a 180 soon, there's a huge risk of him finishing last in the points per pound championship. Looking at the chart, the most obvious narrative here is Valtteri's roll off top. So with his big -9 from Spa, he is now basically facing into oncoming traffic and needs to rejoin the track at pace to avoid also falling out of this top 10. To be fair to the Finn, his margin for safety is 2.5 points, which is a lot in the points per pound championship. But if Valtteri copy-pastes his last 3 race results and prints 3 more bad races, he will be at risk of disappearing. Jumping into the teammate deltas before finishing off with the constructors, Max's lead over Sergio has expanded and George has now built a gap of 32 points over Lewis. This is surprising because going into the break, Lewis was looking like a man on a mission, but now going into Zandvoort, Lewis's mission looks like Mission Impossible. Leclerc has lost some ground to Sainz. This is interesting because in real life, I'm starting to believe that Carlos will beat Charles by the end of the season, but in fantasy, I'm not so sure. I think Charles could still win another race before the end of the season, but I'm not sure that Carlos will. So while this might come down to the wire in real life, I think it will probably still finish like this in fantasy. Lando extends his lead over Daniel, but more interestingly, Fernando has made up some ground on Esteban, closing the gap down to just 21 points. I had Fernando in my team at the weekend, so I'm feeling pretty good about seeing this on the screen. Zhou has managed to make up 15 points on Valtteri, but that's more because Valtteri threw 9 of his points away rather than Zhou closing the gap in any meaningful way. On to Aston Martin, and Seb has actually managed to flip Lance. Going into Spa, just 3 points separated these two drivers, but Lance was ahead. Now, going into Zandvoort, Seb is on top, but it's only a margin of 5 points that keeps him there. Counter to our expectations, the gap between Pierre and Yuki has only slightly expanded, whereas the gap between Albon and Latifi has expanded more aggressively. Based on the data in last week's video, I would have placed a bet on the rate of expansion being the other way round, but fair play to Yuki, he has put in a shift this weekend and deserves to be recognised for that. Last but certainly not least is the Haas drivers, and you'll notice there's not actually a bar separating these two drivers, and that's because there is now not one single point separating them. 14 action-packed races, 6 points per pound championship wins between them, and now there's not one single point between them going into Zandvoort. This really could go either way. Going into Spa, the data suggested that the momentum had swung and was favouring Mick, but now going into Zandvoort, we might need to do a deeper dive to work out who the right pick is, because on the surface, this is perfectly balanced, as all things should be. Jumping in to look at the constructors, Red Bull claimed their 6th victory of the season, and they continue their run of now 13 consecutive podiums. At this point, Red Bull are looking unstoppable, especially considering the only team that can catch them clocked their 2nd non-podium finish of the season. Going into the summer break, Mercedes' run of form was sensational. For me, back-to-back-to-back wins, averaging over 70 points per race, to a hard stop of just 29 points, was probably the biggest surprise from the weekend. Ferrari claimed P2 and Alpine managed to score their 2nd podium of the season. And Aston Martin have now managed to overtake McLaren to claim P5 for the first time this season. Jumping into the points per pound for the constructors, the main call out here is that Alpha continue to flounder, dropping another 2 places in a single race weekend. So that's P1 to P8 in just 5 races, which is a mega fall from grace. Red Bull claimed their 2nd victory of the season, and now going into Zandvoort, Red Bull lead the points per pound championship for the first time this season. One thing to keep an eye on is this dynamic down here. The data was suggesting that AlphaTauri was a hard pass, but the results from Spa have AlphaTauri and McLaren on for a big collision course going into Zandvoort. You'll have to come back next week to see how this plays out. Okay, that just about does it for this video. Thank you for checking in with us. Stay tuned because my next video will be going live Saturday morning, and that will be my picks for Zandvoort based on the data, which I'm hoping will be better than my picks for Spa because I actually swapped Red Bull out for Mercedes based on the trend indicator, and we all saw how that played out. Thank you for taking a few minutes out of your day to look at this with me. I hope you have a great day ahead, and I'll see you again very soon.